All right, so here we are picking up with now variable cost. Okay, so in a prior example or the prior slide, we talked about cost behavior, and we're trying to understand the relevant range and all of these activity drivers. So now we're going to dive specifically into variable cost. So variable cost is the cost that vary in proportion to changes in the activity driver. So here's our example, right? So again, we're going back to our example of the number of maybe speakers that we're producing. So you can tell in this video, as we produce more speakers, right? As we produce more here, our costs, I shouldn't say it, put it like that, sorry. I'm gonna erase that for a second. So as we produce more units of speakers, our cost is beginning to increase as well, okay? So that's what I want you to get from here. So my question to you is, what would be our variable cost here? What is causing our cost to increase? So in looking through this, you should maybe say that our variable cost in this example is the number of units being produced. Every time we produce more, right? Every time we increase our production of speakers, it is causing our total cost to increase. So let's take, for example, here. Assume that Bose produces surround sound systems. Parts for the systems are purchased from a supplier for $10 per unit and are assembled by Bose. Okay, so they're going to a supplier to produce, to buy all of their materials. Okay, and then from there, they take those direct materials and manufacture the rest of it. All right, so the first question or the second question, you would say, what is our activity driver? What is driving our cost? So hopefully you should have said what's driving our cost is the number of units that we are producing. The number of speakers that we're making is driving our costs, right? It's driving this cost to increase. And so what is our relevant range? Well, very similar to what we did in the last slide, our relevant range represents what the cost that we are interested in understanding. So for us, our relevant range is between 5,000 units to 30,000 units. We're interested in understanding the cost associated with producing between 5,000 and 30,000 speakers. All right, so as you can tell, as mentioned in our prior example, our variable cost is usually, as we produce more units, our total direct material cost is also increasing. So here's some need to know things that we're here. Here's some need to know things when we're looking at variable costs. The first one is the cost per unit remains the same no matter what. So here, as you can see in our example, when we go out and buy direct materials from our supplier, the cost per direct material will be $10 no matter what, right? So every time we go and buy these materials, our supplier will always charge us $10 per unit, right? So when we're looking at variable cost, the cost is $10 per unit. Our cost per unit is the same. However, when we're looking at variable costs, our total cost changes, right? So when we produce 5,000 units, it costs us $50,000 in direct materials. When we produce 10,000 speakers at $10 per unit, it was $100,000. So on and on and on. So here, when we're looking at variable costs, our total cost changes as we produce more speakers, okay? Okay. So a good example, if I can bring this point home, right? So imagine, right, many of you have already registered for spring already, but imagine if you were maybe registering for summer or fall or something of that nature, right? It's kind of the same idea, the same concept. So for instance, let's talk about, let's use, I don't have much space here. So I'm gonna, give me a second, I'm gonna switch screens, but I'm gonna take this same example and apply it to you registering for classes, okay? Taking this same example and using it in regards to registering for classes. okay? All right, so let's take, for example, this is gonna represent the number, the first column is the number of classes or units, right? We can do either or. Then our middle column is gonna represent the cost per class or the cost per unit, okay? So to stay consistent, I am going to erase this and I'm gonna put the number of units, okay? And then our last column is gonna represent our like total tuition cost. Okay, so we have a category for that. So let's say, for instance, you take maybe 1 unit, right? So then the cost per unit, the last I checked or what have you, let's say the cost per unit at a community college is $62 per unit, right? So then if I only take 1 unit, then my tuition cost for that, let's say we're not including the fees and all of that good stuff. So then my cost for 1 unit is going to be $62. Now, take for instance, say I want to maybe graduate a little sooner or add more credits to that. So let's take, for instance, I take 2 units, right? The cost per unit never changes, right? It's always going to be $62 per unit. Now, what is going to change is my total tuition cost, right? Because now instead of taking 1 unit, I am now taking 2 units. So if I did this math, if I did $62 times 2 units that I'm now taking, this would be a total of $124. That would represent my total tuition. Now let's take this up 1 notch and let's say I have decided to take 15 units, right? Again, the cost per unit is never going to change. It's going to always remain $62 per unit. Now it's just a matter of how many units am I willing to take or can I afford to take. Now, as a result, if I decide to take 15 units, right, at 15 units at $62 per unit, the total tuition cost that I have to pay maybe Norco College or whatever other school you can think of is my total tuition for taking 15 units will result in $930 in tuition. So what you can take from this is as I take on more units, right here, as I take on more units, my tuition, my total tuition start to increase, right? But what does not change is the cost per unit. Okay, all right. So I'm gonna switch back. All right, so for my visual people, this is what variable cost looks like, right? So in my graph here that I have, it's we have 2 different graphs. One is on a total cost here, and then the other one is the cost per unit, okay? So it's saying as I produce more, as I go along the x-axis, as I produce more units, my cost, my total direct material cost is steadily increasing, right? Okay. And so then if I'm looking on a per unit basis, right, looking at my total units produced, so as I produce more units, my direct material cost per unit does not change. It remains at $10, or in our example that we did for tuition and, you know, cost per units, this will represent $62 per unit. No matter how many units I take or that I decide to take, it will always be $62 per unit. So hopefully you got an understanding of how variable costs behave. And now we're going to take this and move on to fixed costs.